Started. To get this homily started, I want to make one something clear. I will probably repeat it a few times during the homily. Henry David Thoreau was neither a Unitarian nor a Universalist. He was born and baptized a Unitarian in Concord, Massachusetts, but he resigned from the church as a young man. He did not return to the Unitarians, nor did he join another church. He disliked many clerics and most church people. Thoreau loved nature. He saw the Christian denominations around him as being anti-nature, and they therefore held nothing for him. But this critical fact has not stopped thousands of Unitarian Universalists from claiming Thoreau as one of us. One of his best friends was the transcendentalist individualist poet, but not minister, Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose relative Ralph Emerson is a UU forefather. But still, Thoreau is not a Unitarian. In Texas, today, there is a UU congregation which calls itself Thoreau UU, and I imagine he would be shocked by that. In the past, I might have even been guilty of including Henry David Thoreau in my list of UU forebears, but I won't make that mistake again. So that's the first thing I want you to take away from my homily. That being said, many Unitarians are comforted by the writing of Thoreau. I am one of those Unitarians. In July 1995 in Belleville, Ontario, in a bookstore, I bought a used copy of Thoreau's Walden, which I still treasure and refer to. My book includes the essay Civil Disobedience. I bought the book for Walden. Later, I've used the book for Civil Disobedience. I was interested to read that Thoreau, who was born in 1817 and who died almost 45 years later in 1862, lived exactly between the War of 1812 and the US Civil War. I was also interested in learning that Thoreau never married and was childless. Thoreau's sexuality has long been a subject of speculation, including by his contemporaries. There is no evidence to suggest that he had physical relationships with anyone, man or woman. The one thing that is clear from his writings is Thoreau loved nature. Many of you have heard that Thoreau built a cabin on Walden Pond and lived there for 2 years. There's a funny story from people who really follow Thoreau, and they refer to how most Americans believe that Thoreau lived at Walden for most of his life and was in jail for the other half of his life. But in fact, he was 2 years and 2 months at the pond and only one night in jail. And the reason for the American or the wide belief is that Thoreau was such a good writer and wrote about living at the pond and wrote about jail, but more than anything else. Here's what Thoreau wrote about going to the pond. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and to see if I could not learn what it had to teach, or not. When I came to die, I discovered that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life, because living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation, unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave clothes, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms, and, if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world. Or if it were sublime, to know it by experience, and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. The cabin was on land owned by a nephew of the Unitarian minister, William Ellery Channing. When the first time I read Walden, I got the impression, or maybe I wanted to have the impression, that Thoreau had gone deep into the woods to get away from people and get close to nature. I was disappointed to learn that his cabin was only 1.5 miles from his mother's house, that he entertained many visitors who made the short walk to see him, and that on laundry day he took his dirty clothes to his mum's house. He was living close to nature, but he was not exactly roughing it. Perhaps that is just as well, because those comforts allowed him to write nuggets like these. The earth I tread on is not a dead, inert mass. It is a body, has a spirit, is organic, and fluid to the influence of its spirit, and to whatever particle of that spirit it is in me. It is more cheering than the fertility and luxuriance of vineyards, this fundamental fertility near to the principle of growth. Thoreau also wrote, "Nature is mythical and mystical always, and works with the license and extravagance of genius." Not just in Walden, but in several of his books and journal entries, Thoreau wrote beautiful descriptions of nature's positive effects on people. He wrote, "I love nature partly because she is not man, but a retreat from man." None of his institutions control or pervade nature. There a different kind of right prevails. In her midst I can be glad with an entire gladness. If this world were all man, I could not stretch myself. I should lose all hope. Humans are constraint. Nature is freedom. Humans make me wish for another world. Nature makes me content with this. None of the joy she supplies is subject to man's rules and definitions. What he touches, he taints. In thought, he moralizes. One would think that no free, joyful labor was possible to humans. How infinite and pure the least pleasure of which nature is basis, compared with the congratulation of mankind. Thoreau also wrote, "I love nature, I love the landscape because it is so sincere. It never cheats me, it never jests. Nature is cheerfully, musically earnest. I lie and rely on the earth." And finally, Thoreau wrote, "We must go out and re-ally ourselves to nature every day. We must take root, send out some little fiber at least, even every winter day. I am sensible that I am imbibing health when I open my mouth to the wind. Staying in the house breeds a sort of insanity. Every house in this sense is a hospital. A night and a forenoon is as much confinement to those wards as I can stand. I am aware that I recover some sanity which I had lost almost the instant I come outside." When I read these passages among his writings, I feel Thoreau's nature mysticism. People today in Cascadia, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, who feel that they have discovered a new reverential naturalism would be wise to read Thoreau. And those of us who feel sometimes that the non-nature mystics are missing the point of a spiritual life would be heartened by Thoreau's critique. He wrote briefly, "Most men, it seems to me, do not care for nature, and would sell their share in all her beauty as long as they may live for a stated sum, many for a glass of rum." So the second thing I want you to remember from this homily is that Henry David Thoreau loved nature probably more than he loved people, and certainly more than he cared for human-made religions. The third thing I want you to consider is our debt to Thoreau, the nature mystic, as well as to his close friend Emerson, the transcendentalist. Thoreau lived with Emerson for many years, both before going to the pond and after. Philip Gura, a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, says that Unitarian Universalists need to read Thoreau to understand how UUism came to embody certain truths that he saw more than most. The interdependent web of being that Thoreau described in All But Name in Walden is just one of the connections he made that we can now take for granted. In the 1840s and the 1850s, Thoreau was reading essays about Eastern religions, including Hinduism and Buddhism. Thoreau wrote and thought about elevating the life of the spirit over the material, an ethos of simplicity, reverence for the divine in nature, justice and inclusivity in matters of race, and the search for wisdom in Eastern, earth-centered, and other world religious traditions. This sounds like Unitarianism today, but Thoreau was writing this 160, 170 years ago. Richard Higgins, in a 2017 essay that is available online, wrote, "Indeed, Unitarian Universalism's self-proclaimed principles and sources can read like Cliff's Notes version of the Thoreau opus. Respect for the interdependent web of existence, a free, responsible search for truth and meaning, the worth of every person, justice in human relations, the right to conscience as a guide, direct experience of transcending mystery, the wisdom of world faiths, the words of prophets old and new, the guidance of reason and science." Thoreau valued and specifically cited all of these. Higgins continues, Thoreau's impact on American liberalism generally, and liberal religion especially, explains the convergence of his values and UU values. The non-dogmatic, eclectic spirituality Thoreau practiced drew from direct experience of the divine in nature and can be seen as part of the growing interest in spiritual phenomena outside church walls. This strand of religion stood outside institutional Unitarianism for most of the 19th century, but ultimately reshaped our faith. In that way, Thoreau had effects on today's version of Unitarian Universalism. So the first thing I wanted you to take away from the homily is that Thoreau was not a Unitarian, nor any other kind of church person. The second thing is that Thoreau was a nature mystic. And the third thing to recall is that he influenced Unitarianism from the outside, via the Transcendentalists, friends, and through his own writings. I hope that I have inspired you to walk to the library or search the internet to read anything by Henry David Thoreau.